Hey guys, what's going on? It's Jordan here. Welcome back to the channel and thank you for stopping by. So today I want to do a 1-year review on this camera. This was kind of like my first, I guess, professional DSLR. So this is the Canon EOS Rebel SL3. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, when I bought this camera, a few things ticked my boxes, which is why I chose to lean towards this over the Canon EOS M50. I know I've had a lot of people ask me in other videos, would I choose this camera or the EOS M50? I actually wound up going with this over the M50, and I'll go ahead and give you a few reasons why. So first and foremost, this Canon EOS SL3 250D KissX10 200D Mark II, whatever you want to consider it, has the Canon EF mount, so I can use both the full frame and the EFS crop sensor lenses on this camera body specifically. So the reason why I chose this over the EOS M50 was I would have to adapt previous glass that I had already owned to a mirrorless system on top of purchasing Canon EF-M mirrorless lenses for that camera specifically. Now, the reason why I chose this, the Canon M series lineup of lenses is pretty non-existent, and pretty much the only lenses that you can really find for those are like third-party. Canon really hasn't like made a mirrorless system lineup lens mount, so the EF-M line to me is kind of like dead. That's why I chose this. Now, this camera does have 4K and it has 1080. So 4K at 24 frames a second if you're shooting in NTSC. If you shoot in PAL, you can get 25 frames a second. And I'll go ahead and explain this to you here in a second. So 4K 24, 1080 at 60 frames, 1080 at 30 frames, 720p at 60 frames. There is no 1080 at 24 frames per second option on this, unfortunately, but you can go into the menu system and you can change this from NTSC to PAL, and you can get 1080 at 25, which will also change your 4K to 25 frames a second. But here's the thing why I say this. So although it's a downside for this camera specifically that it doesn't have 1080 at 24 frames a second, but you can still get the dual pixel autofocus in 1080 at 25 frames a second with this. So I think that is still pretty good. I mean, it's one extra frame per second. I highly doubt you're going to notice it in a 24 frame timeline, and you still get the dual pixel autofocus. So that right here is video specs and probably one good reason why you should probably pick this up. Now, on top of those video specs, you also get the 24 megapixel sensor, APS-C size sensor on this. So equivalently, when you're choosing lenses or focal lengths, you're going to times that by a 1.6 times crop. My favorite focal length to shoot on this was a 50 millimeter, so equivalently it was 80 millimeters. So if you're going from like a crop sensor DSLR like this to maybe if you're upgrading in the future to a full frame, you're pretty much already going to know what style and what type of lenses that you want to buy when you go into a full frame camera. So this APS-C size sensor, 24 megapixels, still does fantastic photos. Comparatively, this camera over the Canon EOS Rebel T7 that I own, this just takes much more, like, I would say professional looking photos compared to like the T7, and I'm not necessarily sure. I think it maybe just has something to do with the processor that this has, which is the Digic 8 processor compared and over the T7, which I believe has the Digic 4 Plus processor or the Digic 4 processor. So just something to consider. This has the newer processor, which the camera that I'm shooting on right now, which is the EOS RP, has a Digic 8 processor in it also. So this camera right here was pretty much like my workhorse. I use this for like a lot of personal and client related work. I shot a lot of like beer commercials and stuff with this camera, and I mean, just having the 1080p at 60 frames a second was a huge game changer for me. I was using the Canon Rebel T7 at 720 at 60 frames a second, and basically when I upgraded to this, I mean, you could just right off the bat you could tell 1080 was so much crispier than the 720. So I made a video a while ago saying like if you didn't have 1080 and you only had 720p on a camera just to use it, and I still stand by that, but I understand that everybody is trying to move forward in the world of videography. So if you're looking to upgrade 1080 60, if you want higher frame rates like 120 frames a second, maybe look into the 90D or the Canon mirrorless M6 Mark II. So those both have 120 frames a second in 1080p. So if you're looking for a higher quality 1080p video, you can find it there. So what this camera does for being a budget shooter, so I purchased this refurbished from Canon on their website through their like refurbished line. I think I paid like $430 for the body or something like that. So I mean, it's still a really good option. I think this will be my backup for pretty much a little while until I decide to upgrade to something a little bit more professional, and then I'll have the EOS RP as like my backup camera. But this right here, I mean, this is definitely for the price. It's a really good, it's small, it's compact, it has a flip screen. The thing I probably like the most about this camera specifically is the on and off switch, and then the camera record switch. So I basically turn the camera off, turn the camera on, and then turn it to recording video in just one switch. The mode dial on this is super simplistic. You have manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, program, auto, scene intelligent, and like a creatives mode. It really doesn't get any more simple than that. And I mean, on a budget DSLR and Canon's smallest DSLR in their lineup, I really like how Canon just kind of like simplified this camera specifically. So something that might interest some people, I believe I talked about this in my 6-month review as well on this camera, but so if you go into the camera, if you're shooting in 1080s only, now stay with me. So 1080 at 30 frames a second, you can actually do a digital zoom. So you can zoom this from 3 to 10 times crop. So basically it'll zoom it in depending on what kind of lens you're using. So if you're using like a 70 to 300 or a 70 to 200, I mean, basically you can touch out to damn near 2000 millimeters with a lens. But it shoots only in 1080 at 30 in NTSC. So going back to earlier for what I said with the PAL, if you switch this over to PAL, you can get 1080 at 25 frames a second with the live view crop on this. So if you're like shooting a nature documentary, or if you just need like some good buttery B-roll from super far away, or if you're in like a national park, I really think that this camera body specifically as a backup would come in really handy to a good certain amount of people that are looking to either do like some sort of like documentary work, or somebody that needs to film something from far away. I really think that this is like, for as cheap and kind of as budgety as this camera body is, somebody that is looking to start getting into like nature documentaries, or like just needs like some long telephoto documentary B-roll, I guess, if that makes sense, like this would come in clutch. You wouldn't have to go spend a lot of money on a super expensive lens just to get the gain out of that. So yeah, I mean, it's just something to consider. If you have a 75 to 300, you throw this on here, you throw it onto a tripod, and then you go on, you click into it, you do your live view crop, and then you can crop in. So I think this would come in handy for a lot of people looking to do like long extended like telephoto work that don't have the budget to spend on a expensive lens. So a few more things I want to touch on. These use the same batteries that go with the Canon EOS RP. So the ELP17 batteries, that's what they are. For this camera, they're actually surprisingly good. They do last quite a while. Even if you're shooting in 1080 at 60 or 4K, they still last a pretty decent amount of time. So you get a 30-minute record limit. I shot a funeral procession for a friend of the family, I had 2 batteries at the time of that, and I got through basically like 2.5 hours of 4K recording before my memory cards and my batteries were done. So out of 2 batteries, I think that was pretty good, especially with recording in 4K at 24 frames a second. Basically just sat on a tripod for the entire time, but could you have gotten a little bit longer with larger batteries? Most definitely. The batteries that come with this are pretty small, and I really kind of hate that Canon used these same batteries in the EOS RP, but I mean, it is what it is. I think that if Canon would have used the T7 batteries, which I think are the EL or the EPL6 or the EPL10s or something like that, they're a lot bigger. So kind of wish that they would have at least put those in the EOS RP, but the battery life on this with the ELP17s are pretty good. So with that, you do get an HDMI input. You also get a micro USB. You get a headphone jack, and you also get a microphone input jack, so you can record and you can hook up a vlog mic on this. Probably one of the smallest vlogging cameras that you could possibly ever buy. The form factor and the ergonomics on this, to me, I think are really good. They're really, like, this camera to me had become my favorite camera, and it still is probably one of my favorite cameras I think I will have ever owned. So last but not least, kind of like for the pros on this 1 year, is these have like some really kooky features, specifically for video. So like there's old black and white film, you can do like miniature effects, and like you can record in like all these like weird kind of like film, like if you were shooting like a black and white like scene or something, like let's say you're doing like a small short film and you wanted to have like a little black and white scene in there, you could do that with this. I mean, just throw it into the creatives mode, put it on black and white, and then start hitting the record button, because I mean, you don't have to do anything in post really. You can just record it in camera, throw it onto your timeline, and then just go to town with it. So it leaves a little bit less to having to really work with the image that you get from this camera. So it's definitely a good thing. You do also get HDR photos, but they are JPEG, so just keep that in mind. But anybody that does like just wants to like go out and get like really nice photos that they can download to their phone and post them on social media or Facebook or whatever, you can shoot JPEG HDRs with this. This also records an HDR video too. I believe it's all 1080 at 30, which kind of sucks, but like I said, if you switch over to PAL from NTSC, you can do 1080 at 25, so you can still throw that into a 24 frames a second timeline. So I just want to touch base on some of the things that I was kind of disappointed with this after having it for a year. Mainly the most common thing that I was kind of disappointed with on this was just not having the 1080 in 24 frames a second in NTSC. I know I've touched on it before. I can go and switch it into PAL, but sometimes that's a pain. You got to go through the menu, you got to find NTSC, and then you got to switch it to PAL, and then you go out and you got to do this, blah, blah, blah. And then if you need to record 60 frames a second, you got to go back in, you got to switch it to NTSC, then you got to go back into your videos, you start recording in 1080 at 60, and so it's just kind of a hassle. I know that Canon could easily fix this camera with a firmware update. They did it with the EOS RP. Enough people complained with the EOS RP. Canon gave in. They gave them a 1080p at 24 frames a second firmware update, and it fixed it. So I know Canon could easily fix this camera too. Will they ever? I have absolutely no idea. Since this came out, I believe this was released in April of 2019. I don't foresee Canon releasing any sort of firmware at 1080 at 24 frames a second for this camera. If they do, it'll be a godsend. It's just a pain to have to switch it from NTSC to PAL back over to NTSC when you need higher frame rates. So just something to consider if you're looking to purchase this camera. So another thing too is, I know I've touched on this on some of my other reviews and stuff. The 4K on this is super cropped in. So basically how I figured this out, which the 4K is equivalently a 2.6 times crop. I took my kit lens, so the 18-55 kit lens, I put it on here. I filmed in 4K, switched over to 1080, and then I filmed in 1080p until I got exactly the same focal length in 4K at 18 millimeters, and then at 1080p, and surprisingly it was like 29.5 millimeters. So in 1080p at 29.5, so we'll just call it 30 millimeters on 1080, was equivalent to the 4K at 18 millimeters from this camera. So basically what I did was I did a little bit of math, and basically the guesstimate on this was 2.6 times. I forget exactly the equation that I used to figure that out, but it seemed pretty accurate, and so I'm just going to go with that. So basically a 2.6 times crop in 4K. So if you're shooting on a 50 millimeter lens, I mean, you're basically looking at like 106 millimeters. So just something to consider. 4K contrast autofocus. I've touched on it before. The contrast autofocus, from what I understand, Gerald Undone did a video about contrast autofocus, and like, so the way that he explained it, and if you haven't watched a Gerald Undone video, I highly recommend him. He is probably one of the YouTubers that breaks everything down in such a way that it's like so technical that like you just can't not watch those videos. But the way that he kind of like explained the contrast autofocus made a lot of sense. So basically, when it comes down to it, the contrast autofocus is actually more precise at focusing. It just hunts a lot because it has to use contrast to detect the focus. With dual pixel, it's actually a little bit less accurate in the fact that the contrast will kind of like, while it does work and it does keep you in focus, and it's better at that, the contrast, the way that he explained it, it just made it seem like the contrast was that much better, but it's just, it hasn't caught up to where it needs to be for this camera or any other camera with 4K contrast autofocus. Last but not least, I know most everybody else and their mother has basically kind of like touched on, I don't think that the 30-minute record limit on this is a huge downside, but if you are doing like extended recording times, just keep that in mind. 30 minutes is still pretty decent to me, but it might not be necessarily the best for everybody, but it's not a downside for this camera to me. I just kind of wanted to touch base because I know everybody else is all freaking out about Sony's never-ending record limits, but I mean, to be honest, unless you're doing like a 24-hour live stream, you're probably never going to need it. So that's pretty much it, guys. That's my 1-year review on this lovely little camera. If you're looking to upgrade from an SL2 or like a T6 or a T7 like I did, I highly recommend this if you don't want to go mirrorless and have to purchase adapters for EF glass and buy third-party lenses, because like I do enjoy Canon's glass, even their like less expensive budget options like this 24mm EFS. That's a really good lens. With this camera, I love it. It's probably one of the smallest packages. Now, if they made it a camera this size mirrorless, which I'm pretty sure is like their mirrorless lineups, way to go. I like it. I love it. Highly recommend this. This, like I said, will probably be my backup for quite some time until I decide to finally switch over to something a little bit more professional. But other than that, if you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, also give it a thumbs up. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit all the buttons, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.